Hey everybody, welcome. It's just about 1 o'clock, and in just a second here, we're going to get started. So let's take a look here. Let's get me up on the screen. So today we're going to be talking about cameras. We'll give a few minutes here to get some people online. And today we're going to look at different kinds of cameras. We're going to look at PTZ cameras, ENG cameras, and studio cameras, and talk about whole bunch of different options, as a lot of people right now are trying to figure out how they move forward. A lot of people have been using some temporary setups to get their church streaming, or get their school streaming, or get their meetings and their businesses streaming. And as we start to open up, there's going to be some changes there, because now we can't be pre-recording. We have to do it live. We can't have cameras and lights and microphones set up all over the sanctuary. We have to have people in there. And so it's interesting. When this first started, we thought maybe it was going to be a month of this. And then it kept getting pushed back. And now it's like, okay, we're ready to open. Well, you may be ready to open, but your tech team needs to do a little bit of a pivot, because they're going to have to get their permanent solution figured out and probably installed. So, okay, I'm going to jump right into it here. Today, our conversation is on cameras. And as we go through this, if you guys have any comments, please put them in the chat. I will try to reply as much as I can. I'll also try to bring them live. I believe I can see all the comments from Facebook and from YouTube. I can't always reply. Some of the places don't let me reply live, but I am seeing those. So please ask any questions you have. Okay, jump into video cameras. And the first thing we're going to talk about is connection types, because this is important. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about here is coming from experience over the last couple weeks of the questions people are asking. We're not going to get into everything about cameras under the sun, just the things that it pertains to the churches and things we've seen over the last few weeks. So we're going to talk about connection types. That's really important as you're planning your install. Camera types, and then camera control. So I've been watching as many streams as I can, and I'll say by and large, everything looks really good. Everybody's doing a great job, better than I would have expected, considering the amount of time people had to kind of turn around and start streaming live. So it's been really impressive, actually. Also, before we get going too far, if you guys have any questions for me, please, phil@inspermedia.com. Feel free to reach out to me, ask me any questions during the week. You can also message me on Facebook or what have you. Okay. We're going to get going here. So we're going to look at connection types. And the first one, probably most of you are familiar with, it's HDMI, high definition multimedia interface is what that means, if you didn't know. And these cables are what our TVs and our DVD players and our camcorders all use to connect, our computers use to connect. We're probably pretty familiar with it. There are some good things and some bad things about it. The good thing is it's good for short runs. You cannot run these cables very long. Per the original spec, it was like under 20 feet. And now we've done some things with the cables to make them go further, but you're not going to run this 100 feet typically. It's capable of HD and ultra high definition, depending on the cable. But through this connector, you can get 4K down that line. I will say that these are, they need to be converted. I'm jumping ahead. They need to be converted if you're going to do a long run. And they don't have locking connectors, which is something I don't like. If there's a lot of pins in there and if some of those fall out, that can be, I just want to minimize the points of failure as much as possible. So if you use an HDMI, you're probably going to want to convert it to SDI, which is something we'll talk about here in a second, or convert it to Cat 5, Cat 6 fiber. And the last thing is, you can't make these really. And they're pretty expensive to buy if you have to buy a lot of them. You can't go on site, pull cable, and then put on an HDMI connector at the end. So there's some good things with these. They carry audio, they carry video, they carry 4K, but there's a lot of downsides as well. So the next cable that we're typically using is SDI. Stands for Serial Digital Interface. This has been around. This cable's been around for a long time, even when we were doing standard definition. The SD means serial digital, not standard def. That's why I put that there. And it's basically an RG59 or RG6 cable with a BNC connector. A little, you push, you turn, and it locks on. That type of connector. Very easy to make out in the field. There are different types of cable that can handle different bandwidth. Typically, we see HD SDI and 3G, which is 1080p signal coming down this cable. There's also 12G. Typically, if we're doing 4K with SDI cable, we're using 4 cables. So each one is only capable of handling the HD portion, which is a quarter the size of 4K. So there are some 12G, but for the most part, a lot of things are doing 4 cables. So that's something to consider if you're going to be trying to do SDI with 4K down the road. Just something to think about. Roughly, you can go 300 feet before having to reclock these cables. So reclocking means you put them on some device that looks at the digital signal and then retransmits it again. So you can go 300 feet with these. Roughly, I try to stay at 250. It depends on whether you're using RG59 or RG6, but the cable's cheap. You can make it out in the field. So, and it has a locking connector, which is something that I absolutely love. So a lot of times we're taking HDMI at the camera, converting it to SDI, sending it down, and then our switchers, probably, at least the professional switchers, are going to have SDI more than they're going to have HDMI. So SDI is a good cable connector there. Okay, next step here. So now let's look at the third option, which has just come about in the last couple of years. This is called NDI, and it was developed by NewTek, which is now owned by VizRT out of Norway. But NewTek is a company in Austin, and they've been using, you maybe have heard the video toaster way back in the day. They ran on Amigas. They did 3D graphics. They did video switching. And anyway, they've been doing video over IP for a while, but they've finally come up with a format in the last few years called NDI, and it's really starting to take off. And it happens to work right over your network. So if you have Cat5 cables laying around with RJ45 ends on them, you can plug in a different device, get it through your network. This is especially great in campuses like universities, churches, schools, where you maybe already have an existing gigabit or 10 gigabit infrastructure. Any port on the wall can be a video port. So NDI is nice because it's low latency. There have been other formats out there that have kicked video through your network, but they usually took time to encode, de-encode, and when you transmitted, when you looked at the other end, it may be a second or two behind or even more. So this is low latency, meant more for live production. It's not no latency, but it's very, very low latency. It's got a one-to-many distribution. So this is kind of like, I think of it like Dante for video. If you're familiar with Dante in the audio world, you put in any sending device on the network, and any device that can receive that signal can just go and find it on the network and receive it. This is very similar. I can put NDI out on the network, and then anybody that wants to see it can see it. That being said, every time you see it, you're pulling more bandwidth. So you just have to be a little bit careful with that. So typically, I don't want to get too in the weeds here, but typically you're looking at a segmented network where all of your NDI traffic is on a separate VLAN or something, and it has gigabit, 10 gigabit backbones on it. Okay. What I love, the beauty of this signal is that it can carry 4K. It can carry alpha, and alpha is when we do keying, when we chroma key our graphics. Right now, if you're using green and chroma green, you've noticed that you can't get a fade from something, fade out your graphic off the end. That requires alpha, and alpha is basically a black and white signal that says white is what I see, black is what I don't see, and it cuts some things out. So alpha is right in this signal. So a lot of character generators are using this. Pro Presenter is supporting NDI, Pro Video Player, OBS, Wirecast, and they even have a plugin so that you can take NDI and put it into your Zoom calls. So now your network, it becomes a virtual input on a Zoom call like this. It also can carry control information, so PTZ camera information or coloring your cameras. It can carry communications. It can carry tally. It carries your HD video, your 4K, and your 16 channels of audio. So it's a very, very nice protocol to use for carrying video. It does have its quirks, though. You kind of have to be a network guy to figure some of that out. Okay, and then it's not widely accepted. It's commonly used more in software switchers. So if we are looking at a bigger video switcher, it probably does not have NDI. NDI may be being used on the CG side, the character generator side, but probably not the cameras coming in NDI. Something like vMix or Livestream Studio, Wirecast, OBS, and the NewTek TriCasters are going to support NDI, but those are primarily software on the back. So It's getting there, but it's not everywhere yet. And a lot more camera manufacturers, especially Panasonic, jumped on really early. So Panasonic, BirdDog, NewTek, one cable carries power over Ethernet, carries control, carries signal. Plug the cable in the back, everything's up and running, and we'll show you some of that later. Adam said here, is there a standard there that we should all be trying to get our systems equipped with, or are you saying any of these are good? It's kind of a mix. I like to have some HDMI on my switcher so that I can pull in a computer really quickly. I love to have SDI because that's basically a standard. NDI is nice, especially for graphics. Or let's say you want to set up on your campus a master control room where you have a control room where you want to say, I want cameras from the sanctuary and the projectors in the sanctuary or screens in the atrium. But then I also want to be able to broadcast that to the children's facility or the youth room or the gym. And in the gym for basketball games, wouldn't it be nice if we could stream those? Well, if I could just put NDI cameras on the network in the gym and bring them all back to my main control room, that's where NDI comes in really handy. You don't probably have to pull a ton of cable. So I like a mix of all of these, and we use a mix of all of these. NDI.tv is your source to take a look. If you're interested in NDI, go over there. They have a lot of resources. Okay, so now we're going to look at video cameras, and we're going to look at video camera types. So the first one is PTZ, and if you look on the screen, it's this little guy down in the corner here. So a PTZ, that stands for pan, tilt, zoom, typically used if you can't put a camera operator. All right. ENG cameras, that's kind of these middle cameras that are over your shoulder. We'll talk about those. And then bigger studio cameras. If you're doing broadcast studio type stuff, you may have some of these. And I bring these up because there's a lot of churches that have this size camera. Adam, can you run more than one? Yes, you can run like in a BirdDog camera, you can have NDI, SDI, and HDMI going all out of the same camera at the same time. And your switcher can handle all these at the same time. That being said, each camera can come with its own or each format can come with its own complications, such as latency and things like that. So something to definitely field test. So we're going to talk here about PTZ cameras. PTZ stands for pan, tilt, and zoom. These can be discreetly positioned. So if you don't have a good spot to drop a camera and a camera operator and a big camera, that's where a PTZ really comes in handy. Okay. They do not require operators. I don't have to have a person standing there. It's remotely controlled. Most do not allow for a very fluid movement, and they're better for static shots. So I'm going to try and show you something here, and they have small imagers. So the image quality isn't typically as good as a big camera, but let me show you something here. I'm going to switch over to, this is a PTZ camera. And actually, let me go back to I've got a little controller here. This is by BirdDog. So this controller has one cable and it's getting its power and it's doing control. And then the cameras in the other room have one cable coming in, and they are just a Cat5, and I'm getting control and I'm getting my signal back. So one thing you'll notice, though, if I want to do a nice pan across, I'm moving my controller quite a bit, and then it kicks in and it starts panning. Okay. And then I stop and it kind of just stops. It's not all that fluid. This is kind of how most PTZs tend to handle. If I want to zoom in, I'm going to twist my zoom, and that's actually not bad. Now let me speed it up a little bit. All right. And then I have this one set. I got to adjust my exposure here up, and then I've got to adjust my focus. And now let me zoom back out. They're kind of chunky. I mean, they get the job done, but I wouldn't be using this to try and follow a pastor around walking, because I'm moving back and forth and it gets away from you. So it's just not as fluid as if you had a camera person behind the camera. And just to show you, this is NDI. So actually we're seeing this right now on a computer screen. And let me, that's just a piece of software called NDI Monitor, and I can pick up multiple cameras. So let me just jump off my mic here. So here at the top, I see my cameras on the network. And I can pick which camera I want to see. So if I was on a network, I could pick any camera I wanted to be able to control and be able to see. So that's some software that's at that NDI.tv. All right, we'll come back here. Okay, a couple questions. Should we be jumping into 4K, or is 1080 adequate? I would say 1080 is adequate, especially for 4K is not as expensive, but the switchers tend to be pretty expensive, and you're probably not broadcasting out 4K yet. So I don't know that I'd spend the money on 4K. 4K, the human eye is fine with seeing 1080. It's not like the big difference between SD and 1080. The 1080 to 4K difference is just not as glaring. I think 1080p is fine. And then we have Ryan here says, our PTZ loses focus regularly. Is that a lighting issue, camera issue? I would say probably a little bit of both. Because these have the smaller images, they need a lot of light to perform well. So it could, and then I would probably also move off of autofocus and see if you can do a manual focus with your controller. That may be a better bet, because the intelligence in the camera, it's trying to find anything that's moving and focus on it. So that's something you may want to see, is maybe you need to go to a manual focus type of situation. Okay. So here we have the BirdDog that I was just showing you. That camera, they have a P200 and a 400, and I'm not going to remember all the models, but 200 is kind of their base camera. It's $2,800 for the camera. It has NDI, SDI, and HDMI. It has PoE, which is power over Ethernet, so it gets its power right from your switch. They do have some other cameras that are ultra high def or 4K cameras as well. And right now they're running a promo. It's $8,400 and you get 3 cameras and a controller for $8,400. Their controller is pretty new. I will be honest, the software didn't even work all that great until just a few weeks ago. But BirdDog is a really big partner on the NDI scene. And we actually have one of these at our Yankee Hill campus. That's kind of our primary camera. Before we went streaming, that was the camera that we used during the service to broadcast out to the TVs in the atrium. So we have some familiarity with those. Another camera that you may have seen that we talked a lot about earlier was the data video camera. Now, data video, I would honestly say 8 years ago, I was not a big fan. They have been doing a great job lately. They have this little camera, the PTC 140, $1,250. It does have IP control. Early on, the control was kind of clunky on these, but these cameras actually look really good. And they also have a higher version, the PTC 150, which has a 30x zoom, and it's all Sony guts on the inside. Good little camera, very affordable. I will say the PTC 140 is $1,250, and then the 30x option is like twice that. The 20x lens, it will get you maybe to 80 feet for a decent medium shot. If you're going to be more than 80 feet, you really need to look at probably a 30x lens option. These have SDI and HDMI, and they do also have a 4K version that has just come out. Right now with video, it's hard to say what everybody's going to do because we just missed our biggest trade show. So people have new stuff they're coming out with all the time. And we're just going to see when they roll those things out. Phil Zielinski brought up PTZ optics. I don't have a ton of familiarity with PTZ optics. I've been following a little bit. Some folks have said that the focus is a little bit soft on those. I know that they're affordable. I know a lot of churches get into them because they're affordable. I will say on like the higher end stuff where when I'm working with either broadcasters or sports or people who are taking this to the next level, I don't see a lot of PTZ optics. I see a lot of Panasonic, Sony. BirdDog gets great reviews a lot because of the PoE and the NDI. And then don't see a lot of data video either, but I've been very impressed with them. And if you guys haven't been to their website, and if you need any help with data video, let me know. They have got a really killer lineup of switchers and cameras and little widgets and converters. And we've been using a lot of their small stuff for years. But even, and I'll talk about this in the switchers, but little switchers where you flip it's like a suitcase and you flip it up and the monitor's there and you can just plug it in the stream. They have some great stuff. And then they do have a couple of different controller options here. One thing I love about this little, the 180 controller is you have your 4 cameras, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then each one has 4 presets, but they're right there. It's only 4 presets, but a lot of times you have to, like on this BirdDog control, I have to select the camera and then select a preset. Here I have all my presets from all my cameras right in front of me. So I really do like that. They also have a bigger controller here that has an iPad display, and you can work like, I don't know, like 24 cameras or something like that with a lot of presets. So they have some options in the control game as well. Okay. The next camera is getting a bit bigger. This is in the Panasonic line. This one is their 4K camera, and it's around $10,000. It's the Yui 150. Very good looking camera. This last week, I've been working with a church here in town that has one of these, and then they have the smaller dome-shaped Panasonic cameras. I think they were the HE40s. Very big difference in the quality of these two cameras. This camera has got the same guts, electronics, and optics as some of their bigger cameras. Very good, expensive. They do have an HD version, which I want to say is the 130 right now. That is a few $1,000s less. But then they have a nice control option there. Oh, there it is. The HN 130 is their HD version for $7,300. Very high quality. You get a lot of control and a lot of granular control. Let me go back a little bit here. A lot of granular control on these, so I can really dig into this camera and make it match other cameras quite easily. At least it has those features. On some of the smaller cameras, I couldn't even get good manual iris control. So, Jordan, you asked about the Marshall PTZ. Not as familiar. I mean, Marshall has some good stuff. I had some bad luck with Marshall a few years back, but I have not looked into their PTZ. So I'm just going to say that. Trey, yes, the UE 150 is awesome. It is a very good camera for as far as a PTZ goes. So if you want to have a camera that's going to match something else, this is probably one of the ones to go with. And I'll say matching is a big deal. I was talking to a church recently that had a Panasonic ENG camera, a Sony 4K camera, and a PTZ Optics PTZ, and I was wondering why things weren't matching as well. That's going to be tough to get those 3 different manufacturers in 3 different formats to match. So then the other option is Robotic Heads, if we're talking PTZ, and I just want to briefly talk about this. This is basically that you have a pan and tilt head, and you can put whatever camera you want on there, and then that head probably has controls to control the zoom, the focus, the iris of the camera. And a couple here is over here on the right side. This is just another one by Data Video. They have a nice little camera head. And then Telemetrics is another company to consider. And over here, let me see if I had these. Mark Roberts is over here. And Mark Roberts makes some really wicked robotic controls, but they even have the systems where your camera operator can be in a back room with a monitor and zoom and focus controls on a tripod head. And when he's moving that around, it's translating to the robotic head. So you can get those fluid motions. Like, for instance, if I'm running a jib, the robotic head on the end of that jib can give me some very, very fluid motion. So it's not that robotics can't do it. It's just that in these smaller camera formats, they can't get a lot of the good motion. So you're going to spend some money on these, but this is another option. Or if you have the box camera. So let's say you don't need all the audio features and recording features of a big camera. They make just box cameras that are meant for sticking on these robotic heads. And then you get that really, really good camera look with some robotic options. Okay, so now we're going to look at ENG cameras, which stands for electronic news gathering cameras. And these are typically a camcorder. They typically will also record. They're meant for going over your shoulder and going out and shooting video for news. They're generally affordable, but they may be hard to color match. They may not have as much control in a camera like this than you're going to have in a studio camera. And we'll talk about control in a little bit, but you may not be able to dig into this camera as much as a full studio camera. But they often do have a ROP, and a ROP is a remote operation panel, or sometimes called an RCP, remote control panel. So you may want to see if your camera has a ROP option. And here's some cameras that do. There's lots of them. I'm just going to give you some options that we've talked with clients recently. The Canon XA45, this is actually a 4K camera, $2,100, and it does have a ROP, has HDMI and SDI, but this small controller here can at least get you some red and blue coloring options. It can adjust your shutter. It can adjust your iris. It can adjust your white balance. So some of those key controls that you're going to want remotely for the camera, because you really don't want your camera operator to have to be messing with a lot of this stuff. So this is an affordable camera that does have a ROP option. Next one up, I'm going to say, is the Panasonic AJ-PX270. This camera and the Panasonic line, if you're familiar with the 370 cameras, the 370, the 270, and their PTZ back when it was the 120, 130, those have a lot of the same characteristics throughout that camera line. So I could put these cameras in a mixed situation and get things to look pretty good together. So this is definitely camera to look at. 5750 retail on the camera, HDMI and SDI, and it does have a ROP option that just works right through the network. So this is a great camera. The bigger brother to that would be the Panasonic AG-PX380. As you can see, this is a bigger camera. Really, the advantage of this camera over the previous one is that it weighs a little bit more, a little bit sturdier, but you also have interchangeable lenses. That being said, this camera is a 1/3 imager, not great for depth of field. The lens availability is a little bit limited, but we've had these cameras for years. We've used them for a lot of events. They look really good. They feel really good. A little more expensive, $6,300 for the body only. And then you have to have a lens, and the lenses can, start at maybe $5,000-$6,000, and then they keep going up from there. Not going to get into big box lenses with this camera because of the imager size and the connection size, but generally a very good camera. HDMI and SDI, you have the additional lenses. Has a ROP option, also has a CCU option, and I haven't talked about that a lot yet, and I will more in the studio. But the CCU option means that I'm going to hold that until we get further down in the cameras, but that one has a CCU option. If you're going to use these ENG cameras, one thing you're definitely going to want is some type of zoom and focus controls to put down on the tripod. Rather than having people to have to hold their hand up there and try and zoom with one hand and focus with the other one, then they can't get good fluid shots. You're going to want some type of zoom and focus controls. So VariZoom is a company that makes some really nice controls for these smaller ENG cameras. So that's someone to look at. Camera controls, I'm going to say $800 to $1,600. But if you get into bigger cameras, it's going to cost you thousands of dollars. And that's just has to do with some of the ease of use and functionality in these. But this system here that I have in the picture here, this is a kit that VariZoom has, and maybe this was in the $800 range. I don't remember off the top of my head, but came with a monitor that has locking HDMIs on it. It had a little push button that you put for your finger that when you pushed it, it zoomed the monitor in to be able to set focus. It came with a zoom controller, and then also came with a focus and iris controller to put on the other side. Very affordable. Really like this setup. Super nice. So that's one to look at. And then another thing you're going to want is probably think about tally options. One that I like is QB. And there's a lot out there. QB is a wireless system that works with a protocol called TLS that a lot of common switchers have, but it's going to sit Wi-Fi out on your network, and you're going to plug this into your switcher and program it a little bit. And then you're just going to have a little tally light that sits on top of the camera, and the light is powered from the camera or USB, or it has a little battery pack, and it gives a little green light for the operator. But they have a green if you're in preview, red if you're in program, depending on your switcher. It's going to give that light. It's also going to give a light out front so that your talent can see it. And they have some bigger lights that you can mount to the camera so people can see it from further away. And they also have a little kind of a fiber optic light that if you were on a handheld camera, you could put that little fiber optic light into your viewfinder and be able to see if you're on. So QBCUEBI.com, great company to take a look at if you're looking for an easy to use tally solution. Okay, so studio cameras. The advantage of a studio camera, one of the ones that I love the most is cable management. With the PTZ cameras, we talked about how you can have maybe one cable if you're doing NDI to do power and control and signal. Most often, you're going to be running a control cable of Cat5, a video cable of SDI, and probably some power. You're going to have some local power there. On the ENG camera that we just discussed, you're going to have an SDI cable to come back. You're going to need power. You're going to need comms. If you're running a wired tally, you're going to have a wired tally. You may need Genlock, and we're not going to talk much about that here, but Genlock is how we keep all of our cameras in sync to help with latency. So you may have 4 or 5 cables that are loomed together that have to go up to that camera. And when we install these, we'll typically put a faceplate in the wall with all those connectors and build some type of a loom umbilical cable that has all that stuff in it, and then plug all the connections in on the camera. The more you plug and unplug connections, the more you may have something break on you. When you're talking about a studio camera, they're going to use something like Triax, which is an older format, or multi-pin, which is an older format, or now we typically will use SMPTE fiber. which is one thick cable that has copper and fiber optics in it. You plug it into the camera, and now you get power to the camera, you get comms, multiple channels of comms, you get tally, you get control, your video signal from the camera back to the studio is in there, maybe a couple of returns. So from the studio back to the camera. So when you hit a button on your camera, you can see what the director is seeing. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. I'll try and remember, but a lot of stuff down one camera or one cable. So that's super nice. You also have great flexibility and features for in lenses. So if you have a studio camera, you can probably use it close up, but if you're in a very large church, you can put a box camera on it. And these are the cameras that sports is using, big churches, live events. It's going to cost more money. I mean, when you get into a camera, you're probably baseline talking $25,000, $30,000 for the camera. We tend to talk about those in camera chains. So camera chain is the camera, a lens, a viewfinder, and then back to the camera control unit and the ROP or the remote control panel. So you're going to be talking $30,000, $100,000 per camera chain. So they can get really expensive, but you get a lot of really good convenience and features with those. So I talked about the CCU really quick. What the CCU does is allows all of that interfacing that happens with the camera. So that is in your control room. So you plug in your outs from your camera, come out of that unit. It's usually a rack mount unit, 1 or 2, 3 unit rack spaces. Your tally is connected in there. Your comms are connected in there. Your video from the studio that goes back to the camera is connected in there. Power is connected in there. All that is in the unit, all tied up really nice in your studio. And then you just have one cable that goes out to the camera. So I said earlier that Panasonic 380 has an option to add a back to the camera, do one cable back to a CCU. Also, I didn't talk about Blackmagic in here, and I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole of all the different Blackmagic options, but they have some cameras that have CCUs and ROPs and one cable that goes to the camera. So that's what the CCU does. And like I said, these cameras, kind of the disadvantage for you is just they're expensive. I can't think of any other real disadvantages. They're big. You have to have a operator to control them, but they're just expensive. So this is that CCU I just talked about. I'm not going to go back into this again because I kind of jumped myself. The one of the advantages here is the video return, and this is something I will talk about now. So the video return, and if you watched my webinar on directing, gives the camera operator the ability to see what is going to program, what is going out streaming to the internet. So if I can't see the screens in the room, I have no idea if you already have a shot of the lead singer or not. So in a typical studio camera situation, you have a button that you push and it's called your return, and you can see what the director is sending to you. So you can, sometimes we send a multi-view down that. Sometimes we send program. Usually it's program. They hit that button and they can see, and now they can create a shot that's complementary to the one the director already has. If you don't have returns, and I'm guessing most don't, think about putting another monitor on the side of the camera or on the floor or something with a cable coming back from your switcher showing what the director is taking at that moment. So recently we're working on an install now where we're building the face plates to go in the wall. And I put in an SDI connection for the camera back to the studio, but then also two coming from the studio back so that I could run a monitor there if I want. I could set up a return for the camera operator to see. Maybe it's a teleprompter is another thing that I'm sending back through that cable. But the video return is something you may just want to consider. That'll help your camera operators in the future. So now we're going to talk about camera control. And I want to show one really quick here. Let me just pull this out. Here's a camera control unit. Let me see if I can show you here. And this is very similar to the ones over on the right side of your screen. And what this allows me to do is I can adjust the iris right here, and I can adjust the black levels, and I can make some coloring adjustments. And depending on the camera, I can put in ND filters or soft filters or star filters. I can usually change my white balance using the RCP. And I just want to show you really quick. I have a camera that is connected to this RCP, or this ROP. And just by moving this lever, I'm able to adjust the color balance on that, or the brightness on that camera. Now, in these types of situations, earlier I didn't show very well on the BirdDog, but as I adjusted the color, it was kind of steppy. Let me see if I can go back to that here. And if I'm going to adjust the exposure, let me see if I can do this. I may not be able to have the control right now. I don't have it set up properly. No, I'm just looking at the wrong camera. Stand by for just a second here. Okay, here we go. So here I have the right camera. And if I adjust this iris, look how steppy that is. So if I go to this shot and it's really bright and I need to turn down the iris, that's really kind of chunky. Okay. But if I come back over to this camera and I'm going to adjust it, much smoother adjustment. Okay. So that's something to consider. This is the ROP connected to the Panasonic 270. So this is that sub $6,000 camera connected to, I want to say the ROP is around $2,000, but very nice, smooth control. So if he takes this camera, I can quickly pull that down and it's not as drastic or steppy as that other one. I can also adjust the black levels. And I was working with a client the other day saying your black levels seem to be really high. Well, let me just adjust this. This time I'm adjusting the black level. So see how everything kind of got gray? In post-production, we call it crushing the blacks. Well, here I can crush the blacks with this control. So I'm just going to try and show this a little bit. This is adjusting the black levels. Okay. I also have control on this to set the white balance. I can adjust the red and green. So I can do a little bit of color correction in these. There's a lot more detail you can go in on this ROP, but if you can get this with your camera, it's something you should really consider. At least right now, get a camera that allows this as an option. I'm going to also show really quickly here. You're not going to be able to hear my mic very well, but I'm going to show you just the difference. We looked at a PTZ earlier, and I can go back to that, and here's my motion control. Let me turn up the iris here and do some motion control of this PTZ camera, right? Not something I can really watch and control very well if someone's moving around, but let me go to a regular tripod camera. And this has those VariZoom controls. And we'll just do a couple moves here. And I also have it set to manual focus. You can see the difference. So as I'm able to move around here and zoom in, much more fluid than if I was on that PTZ. I zoom all the way in here, and it's hard for me to see because I can't see my monitor. But then I've got focus control. I can dial that focus in. And right now I only have one tripod handle on here. If I had two, it could be much more stable. But I actually have a shot at being able to follow around a person on the stage. And the biggest thing there is when I'm following the person around on the stage, I can slow down. I can ease in and out of shots. So that's just another really good advantage of having some of those controls. Okay, if you have any questions about that, please don't hesitate to ask. And we talked about all that stuff there. So I want to talk at the end here. I'm just going to talk a little bit about engineering. And I talked about this in my previous presentation on directing, but a lot of the differences between the PTZ to the ENG camera to studio is in what kind of control can we get over our colors? What kind of control can we get over light balances? And how do we measure that? So I'm just going to talk really quick here about waveforms again. And if you saw this before, it's going to be repeating, but a waveform you can see this on your viewfinders on a lot of the cameras. Otherwise, Blackmagic has some nice little waveforms that are pretty inexpensive, but this is going to measure the luminance values from black down here on the bottom to bright white. Okay. And it's going to show me across the frame from left to right, what are my values from black to white. Okay. So in this situation, we are way too high. Here's our 100 mark and we are way too high. So if I'm the person who's watching this in engineering, I'm going to use that iris control on my remote operations panel, and I'm going to pull that down a little bit. It's very hard to have a camera operator adjust their iris. And I say, okay, open it up, close it a little bit. That's too much. Open it back up again. So that's another reason why we want to have some type of a control unit. So the next piece here is white balancing. So one of the things that the ROPS allows us to do is white balance remotely. So my camera operators, we may not get them all out at the camera at the same time. I may not have the right lighting all the time when they want to white balance. So I can white balance remotely. And basically all that's doing is saying in our color temperature spectrum, and here you show 2000 Kelvin to 8000 Kelvin, we go very much from red to blue. Okay, so based on the lighting in the room, if you're using LED lights, you're probably up higher in here in maybe the 5,000, 6,000 range. If you're using incandescent lights, you're going to be in the cooler range, maybe around 3,000. So the camera needs to know what that color temperature is, and all the cameras want to be reading white the same way. So you want to color balance or do a white balance on all of your cameras. That's one of the first things that you're always going to do. So make sure you, in the directing seminar, I talked about that some more, but make sure you look at your camera, figure out how to white balance, and do that before your event, and make sure all those cameras switch between them and make sure the colors look the same. Okay. So you've probably seen these bars before. And when we're talking about colors, waveform measured the luminance from black to white, but this SMPTE bars has different color values, and we use a vector scope to measure those color values. So if we were to look in this graphic, here's kind of, and I don't remember off the top of my head, I have a graphic here about the different color bars, but this is not bright white. It's right here. This bright white down here, that's up here at the top. So we're seeing left to right, we're seeing these color values. Okay. Let me take another step here and we'll show you again. This is that vector scope. So you can see we have a red box, magenta, blue, cyan, green, yellow. And what we're doing is when we look at bars, we typically would have those hit right in those boxes, which is probably not going to happen based on your lighting. But what I will do is I'll put my cameras up and I will look at the luminance values on a waveform, and I'll look at this vector scope and see, does this color pattern look very similar on all three of my cameras? So if I see that this red is closer to red on two of the cameras, but this whole dial's kind of shifted this way on another one, I need to adjust some color back more towards red and less towards blue. So it gives me a more objective way of looking at my colors. And there are a lot of videos online for how to use vector scopes and waveforms, and I'll try and post them as a resource. But let me take a look here. If we look at a set of SMPTE bars here, we can see what they look like in a vector scope in each of those dots there, and then what they look like on a waveform. And this is something I mentioned last week, just also when we're talking about tone from an engineering perspective, I'm reading the numbers more than I'm looking subjectively, but are we getting good audio? And that's for the audio seminar that we did with Jeff Cranfield last week. You can take a look at that online. So how to use this in a practical way is, in this case, I use a color chart. Now, these color charts, this particular one is ridiculously expensive because it's color calibrated. But I will take, on the back of this chart, I have white. So I set this out on my stage, and this is about 3 feet wide, 2 feet tall. And I'm going to go to the white side, and I'm going to put on my speaker lights, and I'm going to white balance this color chart. Then I flip it over and I put all the cameras on this, and I look at that vector scope and I compare the cameras and say, of how the vector scope looks, are they the same as I switch from camera to camera, or do I see these shifts in that vector scope? And if I do, I want to kind of eliminate those. So I want to look at this, just gives me something that is an absolute reference that I can look in my three cameras and compare them back and forth and see, do they look the same? Okay. So it doesn't have to be this color calibrated SMPTE chart. It could be any type of a poster or something you have that you know how it should look in the room, and you can just compare the three cameras. Because if you just have a person stand there, to some degree you can do that. But the different angles and different lighting may look different. And if you color correct it for the fact that there was a red light on this side, well, then when the lights change, it's going to look kind of funky. So you want to get your lighting as flat as possible, find something really objective and flat that you can put out there that has color, and then go back and forth between those cameras. All right. That's about all that I have for today. I know we're going a little short right now on time. We've been going longer on some of the other ones, but I just want to give you guys a little bit of an overview about different cameras that are out there and different styles of cameras and when you should use them. So just to recap, I've been getting a lot of calls about PTZs, and PTZs are great. I will usually say, try to find an ENG camera is probably where I'd start. An ENG camera, at least for your main follow camera for the pastor. Then use your PTZs to fill in, because those cameras, you can't really move them around live. So I might use a PTZ and have a wide shot of the whole sanctuary area that I can cut away to. I might use that for my baptism down camera or a reverse camera to get some reactions of the people, or maybe something that's shot during communion or an altar shot. But the reality is that those cameras, I'm just going to say it, those smaller PTZ cameras, you are not going to be able to follow some live action. You set that camera up, you go to it, you go off of it, you move it somewhere else. So I usually want at least one camera that a person can move around. And when you do that, try to stay in the same manufacturer. Find some cameras that I can get some control and be able to color correct, or you're going to notice right away, man, that front camera looks really good. Those other cameras don't look good, and you're kind of stuck. So that's something to consider there. On the ENG cameras, there's a lot of different manufacturers, a lot of different formats. 4K seems really enticing right now. One thing I saw on a 4K camera recently, I'm not going to remember the camera. It may have been the Sony, but someone said, can you run 4K out the HDMI and something else out the SDI? And they said, no, like because of bandwidth issues, you couldn't run 4K out of both at the same time. I don't remember what the issue was, but look into those cameras and say, what is it actually going to take? If I'm going to spend the money on a 4K camera, am I going to be able to really use that in my entire workflow? Does my switcher take 4K? Your encoders probably aren't taking 4K right now. Another option I did not mention here, and actually, let me just see if I can, and I don't have this ready at all, but let me just see if I can pull up a website here and show you another option since we have a little bit of time. And that is in using the 4K cameras. And there are a few different manufacturers who do this. I'm going to go to data video here, and let me find this for you really quick. And if you guys have some questions, please throw those to me. But basically, the idea behind this is that you're going to take a 4K image, which is 4 times that of HD, and you're going to just crop out the area that you want to be able to see. Okay. I'm having a hard time finding this on the website, but let's say we have this big 4K image. Okay. Put one 4K camera on your entire sanctuary area there. Okay. Of your sanctuary. Then in this piece of software hardware, you can pull out some 720p or 1080p sections of that one image. And in the particular one from data video that I was looking for, you can either do 2 cameras in and get 4 camera shots out of each 4K camera, or you can do 1 camera in and get 8 shots. So you can even have a camera that just pans back and forth the whole time. It's a virtual camera. 1 camera in the room. This is panning back and forth. This close shot is of the pastor. This close shot is of the altar. This is a shot moved over of where the pulpit or the lectern is. I can have one that is on a joystick and I can control it kind of like a PTZ. So that's another option to be able to use one big camera. The big caveat there is if I've got this 4K image, if you got to kind of know what's my end format. If my end format is 720p, I don't want to zoom in any more than 720p area. Once I zoom in more, I'm going to start to get some bad focus. It's kind of like a digital zoom in a camera, which is mostly worth nothing. Okay. So we're no longer looking at optics. We're trying to digitally make that bigger, and the pixel just doesn't exist. So datavideo.com is a place where maybe you want to go and look and see if that's an option. If not for everything, at least for one way to use a 4K camera and get a lot of play out of that device. So that's something you may want to look at. I think that's about all that I have for today. If you guys have any questions, please let me know. Just as you're moving forward, think about, try not to just look at the price. That's a concern, but I wouldn't start there. I'd start with, what is the type of final product that we want. I know for me personally, when we're doing slower songs, I like to have a way for my camera operators to be able to pan, zoom very well, and blur their focus. So that if you looked at the directing seminar we did last week, blur their focus when I do a slow dissolve. If I don't have a camera that's capable of doing that, I have to throw those options out the window. If I just have PTZs, I'm not doing any live zooms, pans, or tilts. Those are going to be a series of static shots. If your pastor moves around a lot, then you're probably just going to be on a wider shot the whole time. It's just not going to be possible to follow him in a PTZ. And I know there are options out there for things that maybe are auto tracking. I worry about the reliability of those. If your pastor is like some of those I've worked with, they kind of like to fake you out, act like they're going this way, cut back the other way. You don't want them faking out a camera. A live operator is probably the best way to follow those things. And they can frame the shot really well. In the directing seminar, we talked about how you want to give some looking distance to the person. Having a live person on a camera is going to be the best way to do that. So if you're looking for affordability and flexibility, the ENG camera is probably the best way to go. If you're really in this for the long haul and we really need to have a super high quality production, and maybe we're looking at even broadcasting down the way, then maybe look at investing in a studio camera or a studio camera package or something that gets all those controls down into one cable, makes it easier to use, gives you some other lensing options in the future. Right here, Ryan says, I would not recommend using a PTZ unless you have more than one camera. Very, very good point. Anytime someone says, yeah, we just want to do one camera, I always try to at least get two cameras in there, whether it's a PTZ or an ENG camera, just so you can have the closer shot and the wide shot to dump off to in case something gets out of control. I can just go wide. My audience can still see what's going on while I reset the camera. So one camera shoot, very difficult. If you're doing one camera, then you're probably going back and forth from graphics to a camera. That could get a little bit old for your viewer, but just one camera trying to follow someone around the whole time, or a static shot where you're really wide watching the action, can get a little boring for people. So that's something to consider. If you guys have any questions for me, please feel free to email me. Again, it's phil@instrumentmedia.com. And then just coming up tomorrow for our webinar, we're going to have Adam talking with Dave Madden. If you guys are familiar with Dave Madden at all, those of you in the Lutheran sphere, the National Youth Gathering, Dave has played for music and composed a lot of music for those. And he's had the Isolation Congregation on Facebook ever since this started, all the way through the Lenten series, where he's getting people from around the country and musicians together on, they were doing Wednesday nights during Lent, and also they do every Sunday. So Adam's going to have a discussion with him. And then later this week, I'm guessing it's probably going to be Thursday, I'm going to be doing a webinar on switchers. So we're going to talk about various streaming switchers and live production switchers and the differences between all the options out there. And then next Wednesday, we will get back together, Leah and Adam and I, to talk through another Church Next webinar. I really appreciate the time, everybody. Again, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask, and good luck. Everybody take care.